This is Josy Catoggio for Feminist magazine, and my guest is Andrea Dworkin, who is the author of a novel called Mercy, and also Pornography, Men Possessing Women, Intercourse, Letters from a War Zone, and Our Blood, and Woman Hating, which was the first one I read, and Right-Wing Women.
It's a story of much suffering and some success and some failure. Mercy was actually published in England a year ago, and it was impossible to find a publisher here who would do it. And finally, a small press run by two quite young left-wing men undertook to publish it, which is why you can read it now in the United States.
As a feminist reader and a feminist bookseller, I think Mercy is the most extraordinary book I've ever read, and that's really saying something. I have read thousands of books in a lifetime of being a total book junkie, and this novel, it's every woman, it's every woman's story, it's universal. I mean, I wish I could have it translated into every single language and give it to every woman on the planet, and I don't usually rave like this about books, but Mercy is extraordinary. It made me think in some ways of, you know, in Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own, where she talks about if Shakespeare had a sister, and talks about how, you know, if someone with that kind of genius was born into a woman's body, what would have happened to her, and that she never would have gotten to create those incredible works. Well, you know, the character Andrea is Shakespeare's sister. I mean, she is this brilliant, wonderful, extraordinary talent who happened to be born into a woman's body and has to struggle to try to express herself and is brutalized at every turn, but it's mind-boggling. This book is so amazing. I mean, I don't even know what to ask you. I'm just so awestruck by it. But it takes on God and men and society and the family and incest and everything. It's an amazing story. So how much, the character is named Andrea.
Yes.
Is she you or is she every woman? I mean, to me, she's some of both.
I think that's fair. What she is or who she is everything that I know. And what I know through my own experience, which includes the experience of talking to and knowing many, many, many women, of living in many places, of seeing many things. Usually, at least for me when I've written, I have the sense that a lot of what I know is in a book, but not everything. And with Mercy, for the first time, I really feel as if everything that I've learned as a human being on this planet is in this book. And so it's not autobiographical in the sense that if a reader were to pick out what appears to be a fact and say to me, did this happen to you? Or more to the point, say, this did happen to her, which is the way it usually goes, it would most likely not be true. It wouldn't be factually accurate. But everything in the book did happen to someone. And, to me, it's a novel that's made out of the lives of many women.
Well, some of the things in the book did happen to you because I've read your nonfiction writing, and I know, for example, the experience in the Women's House of Detention happened to you because you wrote an article about it.
Yes. The experience happened to me. I'm not sure that if I wrote about it in a nonfiction way, I would write about the same parts of it. I mean, there's something about fiction, or at least what I was trying to do in Mercy, was to show the interior experience, to show what it is to have these things happen to you. When you write nonfiction, you write for a different kind of credibility. You have to prove a lot to the reader. You have to prove that you were there, that you remember certain things. You have to have a chronology that makes sense. This book is basically almost an anti-narrative. It says that a nightmare doesn't take place in a linear modality. You can't tell a story about it that goes from the beginning to the end, because when it happens to you, your forgetfulness, your lack of memory, the way in which you bury it inside of you is part of what helps to keep you alive. So what I've tried to do has been to take the level of atrocity that, in my experience, happens to women, and to try to show it from the inside out, try to show what it feels like, what it really is, outside the realm of conceptualization, outside the realm of intellectual argument. So there are things in the book, including being sexually attacked, I suppose, in prison, at a time when it wasn't recognized as sexual abuse. And this just for people's information, this was by male doctors. It was not by the women who were also prisoners. And I was hurt very badly, and it's something that obviously has stayed with me a very long time. The part of the experience, though, that more informs the book than the literal happening is the fact that I had no language with which to discuss the experience. I had no one to talk to about the experience. The women's movement didn't exist then. There was no one to help me understand what had happened to me. When I came out of the Women's House of Detention in Manhattan, which is, I was arrested and put there for an anti-Vietnam War demonstration. When I came out, I lost my capacity to speak at all. And I've learned that for women, language is this extraordinary privilege. I mean, the effort that we've made over the last 20 years to try to name what it is that happens to us in a culture in which we've had no room, no space, no freedom, no justice, no fairness. The language has only been used against us. And so it's the speechlessness of the woman that informs mercy almost more than the literal event.
Well, that's one of the things that's so utterly dazzling about it is that, Andrea, the character, is connected for me with Andrea, the author. And the character, even though she is really inarticulate as a result of all of the things that have happened to her, is still telling you her life in ways that just take my breath away. I mean, I don't know how you found the words you found, but you did find them.
On one level, it's a mystery to both of us, and will probably stay that way. I undertook to write a book that I didn't know if I could write it. And when you're using language to talk about the lack of language and to talk about kind of the breakdown of a person's ability to have a synthesis between reality and consciousness, which is what this book is really about, then you can't know that that's something that you can actually achieve. And when I thought about, I knew I wanted to write about one woman being raped repeatedly over and over again in the course of a lifetime, because I think that that's really crucial to women's experience. I think it's crucial to why we can't form an effective political movement for our freedom. I think it's crucial to why we give up, why we surrender, why we burn out, why we commit suicide, why we're depressed by the time we're middle-aged, unless we're flat on our back with Epstein-Barr, which is the current epidemic. And I didn't know if it was really possible to write a book that had the form that I wanted this book to have. And so there's no way that I can say to you, oh, it just happened, oh, it just came to me, because I worked like hell to write this book. And what's mysterious to me is, in the end, the fact that suddenly it exists as a separate thing from me. You've read it. It's not with me in my room, in my privacy, but in fact it's been a communication from me to you in a way that's larger than anything I could have imagined, really.
Really, it's larger than life itself. It's enormous. It's a goddess of a book. Let me talk a little bit about the character, Andrea, because one of the things that struck me about her was the way in which she starts out in life, as I did, as a kind of working class kid who is dazzled by literature, who is just enraptured by what appeals to her about the freedom of language, who reads Walt Whitman and Ginsberg and, all of the poets that felt to her that they were really talking about the heart of life, and who believes, as I did when I was a child, that she could do that. And then comes up against the reality that she's in a female body and it ain't allowed. And sort of some of the transmutations that her affection for Walt Whitman in particular goes through.
I have been recently criticized for not having enough empathy for him.
I think
in
you have
Mercy.
enormous empathy for him.
Yeah, I think it's really a bum rap. I mean, the book is in its form, in part, in its language, a tribute to Whitman. And Whitman did call Leaves of Grass a language experiment. And in a funny way, this is something the same. This is the girl's book. This is the girl's version. This is the song of myself that a woman can never write, because there's not enough of myself that is kept alive for me to be able to do it. And at the same time, that is the story that I'm telling, that the woman can't maintain a self in the way that he did, because she's continuously being attacked, and the boundaries of her body are continuously being violently broken apart by men who think, for one reason or another, that they own her, whether it's for a night or as in marriage, for a longer time. And I really love Whitman, but part of what this book says is that rape changes a woman's relationship to culture, and that all the lies that men tell in their poetry that we love so much, that literature that we love so much, are lies that will kill us. And we have to understand that they are lying, that they never meant to include us, that we read it in where it didn't belong, and have based our sense of humanity on a real misreading of their intentions towards us. I think that's very painful.
It is, and it's excruciating for your character, and it takes her a really long time to get it. I think she's extraordinarily brave. The Andrea of the book keeps persisting in trying to be free no matter what happens to her, and I am just amazed at her courage. I don't know how she keeps going. I mean, there are lots of times when she wishes for death as a kind of mercy, and yet there is such a passion in her for freedom that she goes up against, God and man and everybody, just to try to speak those words that she thought, she would be allowed to speak.
Yeah, it's wonderful to me that you are a reader of this book. One of the things that was most difficult for me when it was published in England was that there were several women who said to me, "Why is she so stupid?" And I would say, "Well, what do you mean, stupid?" And, thinking, my God, she's not, what are they talking about? Of course, what they meant was, why doesn't she have the middle class protections that I have? Yeah. Why hasn't she been smart enough to find a man with some money? Why hasn't she, understood the world that she lives in? And why doesn't she know that she's not allowed to go out after dark?
She understands it. She won't accept it. She's defiant.
Well, that's it. She won't accept it. There are big parts of it that she doesn't understand because she doesn't have the protections of the middle class. That's not where she came from. That's not what she knows. And, what we know about sexual abuse, middle class conventions, in fact, are not much of a protection anyway.
That's right.
But when you are poor enough that you actually do live out on the street, that you actually do have shelter from man to man to man, the level of understanding gender changes, because gender then becomes the absolute determinant of what happens to you. And the only way out is somehow through some kind of passage in which you trade that freedom that she values for the constraints of a cage. And that is what she refuses to do. And as a result, she is, there are two endings to the book, and in one of them she destroys herself. In the second ending, she begins to kill men. And it seems to me that those are kind of two very important poles of reality. I'm just in the process of turning 45, and I have seen a lot of women die. Some of them have been murdered by men. Some of them have killed themselves. I have not seen women killing men who hurt them. The ones that I know of in the last 5 years, maybe 7 years, go to jail when they do. Usually have been, beaten and terrorized for long periods of time before they will even consider striking back. And so the first ending of the book is a what I call a righteous suicide, not a personal suicide. It's a political suicide. She takes the Vietnamese Buddhist monks as her example when they protested the Vietnam War and they put themselves on fire. And that is the choice that she makes to protest the world that she lives in. And in the second ending, she begins to engage in destroying property, destroying pornography stores, following rapists, killing them, following batterers, and in general beating men up. And one of the real problems is that people are very upset about the second ending and not at all upset about the first ending. And I think that that's an outrage. And it's one of the reasons that I made this book in the way that I did. I wanted those two endings to stand next to each other, and I wanted the society to say out loud so that everybody could hear it. Look, it doesn't matter when she dies, it does matter when he dies.
Despite everything that he's done to her up until that point.
Absolutely. Yeah. None of it is a justification for hurting him.
Yeah. Well, the thing that amazes me is the extent to which she maintains this fierce pacifism up until that point. I mean, she is absolutely the girl who believed in peace. And you talk about her going to jail for peace, being brutalized for peace, how the leftists in the peace movement, basically just sacrifice her and the people of color. I mean, they don't matter. It's only the leftist boys that matter. And which was pretty true to my experience as someone who was a peace activist when I was a teenager. And yet she has this reverence for everything that happens to her. Up until the very end, she refuses to even defend herself.
Yes, she says, and I think that most women do feel this way, although most women do not politicize it. She says, I would rather do anything than kill him. And no matter what harm comes to her, she maintains that. She runs away, she tries to escape, even escaping into the arms then of somebody else who hurts her, somebody who appears to rescue her, but in fact replaces the rapist that she was trying to escape from. And she doesn't want to take a human life and cannot find any way out. And I think that probably what I've been most criticized for has been the fact that I guess when people read my work, they say, well, I can't find a way out. If this is true, I can't find a way out. And I think that's the truth. I don't think there's a way out. There's not one way out that an individual person could take now. I mean, maybe socially, politically, together, we can create a way out. But as long as rape is a commonplace experience and, battery is accepted and incest is practiced and women are prostituted, there is no way out.
Yeah, and you talk in the book about the experience of homelessness for hers, and there is this really amazingly poignant section about walls and what it means to be able to have walls, because she has no walls for most of the time. And I think it's really true that even with actual physical walls, women have never had any place to be safe. The revelation of my life was that if I wasn't even safe at home, when I wasn't even safe going away into my own brain or disappearing into literature, there was no place on earth for me. And she ultimately comes to the point where she realizes that even God is the problem.
Yes, she faces the problem, I suppose, that all people who have suffered face, which is, if there's a God, why is this happening to me? And for her, the question begins when she's a child and she's molested inside a movie theater. And she's trying to decide, the way that children do, was God there or wasn't God there? I mean, maybe he was somewhere else. Maybe he was busy. People are starving in other places. But on the other hand, maybe he was watching. And if he was watching, what does that mean? Or did he just turn away for a minute and then the bad thing happened? But even if that's the case, why did he create the man who hurt her? How could he do that? And that kind of inquiry goes on throughout the book until she reaches a conclusion. And the conclusion that she reaches is that God is there. He does watch. He likes it. We're his pornography. That's why rape exists. And, my theology, my personal theology, isn't very much more sophisticated than hers is.
Well, I at least got to the point where I decided that man had created God rather than the other way around, and that therefore it was really men that were still the problem, because that felt so much more human scale to me. If I thought it was God, I wouldn't be able to go on living.
Well, I think that it's that there's a chapter in the book that begins at Masada, where basically a big rock, a high cliff in Israel in the desert, where when the Romans occupied Palestine, a group of Jews committed suicide rather than surrender to the Romans, and she basically understands that the women and children did not commit suicide. The women and children were murdered by the men. I mean, a child cannot commit suicide. And that the men were acting in behalf of this God of theirs. And, I think that one very much underestimates the resilience of patriarchy unless one understands the power of the Father. And that's really what all the stuff about God in Mercy is about. It's about the power of the Father here on earth, where when he touches you, it hurts.
You talk also about her experience of seeing pornography, in particular Deep Throat and Linda Lovelace. But yet this novel takes place before Linda Lovelace came out as a battered woman. Would that have made a difference to her, do you think, if she had known that? She sees the bruises and she knows it, but if she knew that Linda Lovelace could publish a book that would tell the world the truth, would that have made a difference to her?
It probably would have. One of the things about this book that I think is interesting is that if you look at it historically, each chapter takes place in a given year and is sociologically real to that year, to that era. And the book ends in 1974, a year after Deep Throat has been released, and many years before Linda Marciano spoke up about her participation. And if you had anticipated in 1974, if you had tried to tell people that the level of sadism against women would be what it is now, people would have thought you were crazy. I mean, including the women's movement, including every feminist I can think of, every feminist I could name. And we've already forgotten that. We've already forgotten that, 18 years ago, in fact, the sadism wasn't at the level that we currently accept as normal. And so what she's doing is she's walking around Times Square. She herself has been throat raped, which we know is a phenomenon that did happen after the release of Deep Throat to many women, to some gay men. Women died from it, gay men died from it. And she is looking at what she calls the women under glass. And she's trying to understand, are they human or aren't they human? And she thinks that they are human. And in particular, she wants to know who this girl Linda is. And Linda becomes a kind of friend of hers, a way for her to assert a common humanity. Linda is human and she's human, and that's it.
A lot of people misperceive you as a censor. And there has been a lot of discrimination against you as a writer as a result.
Yes, I mean, life has been hard. It has not been easy. The fact that my whole life's work as a writer is the work of a dissident writer, the work of a writer in rebellion against this society and all of its values, has not meant to people that they should be concerned about the fact that I can't publish in my own country, for instance, or that my last 3 books had to be published in England before they could find publishers here, or that maybe, just maybe, the pornographers who make billions of dollars off of exploiting women's bodies, maybe they're not telling the truth about me. Maybe they're actually lying. And in point of fact, if you would read any of the books, you would know that they were lying. You would know that the interpretation that a woman taking an anti-pornography stance means that she is puritanical and censorious is absolutely impossible to reconcile with the books that I have written. And therefore you would either decide something is going on that I don't understand, what is it? Or you would decide that you didn't want to know because all of your friends would get angry with you if you had a point of view that was different from theirs. And in fact, probably the most shocking part of it for me has been to watch how willingly people who think of themselves as rebels have been willing to accept the propaganda that flows through the media about me, about my work, about the women's movement, about addressing pornography as a civil rights issue for women. And, the fact of the matter is everybody thinks that in their own time they're going to be brave. They think that if they had lived during the time of slavery, they would have recognized it. They would have done something about it. If they had lived during the Nazi period, they would have rebelled. They would have dissented. They would have done something brave. Well, hell, it's easy when it's in the past. This is the present. There is a global trafficking in women. Women are being hurt in this global trafficking. It is a slave trafficking in women, and something has to be done about it. One can do something about it and express oneself fully at the same time. And probably what has been, so unspeakable, so cruel, has been watching people line up on the side with the money and the power and pretend that that's the dissident side. Pornography hasn't been a dissident expression probably ever, but certainly not in the last 30 years. And this endless use of women so that a bunch of pimps can't express themselves, is not something that's compatible with freedom for women, and therefore it's not compatible with freedom.
Let's talk a little bit about the ordinance that you developed with Catherine McKinnon for the city of Minneapolis, because there has been a lot of assumption made about that. I've heard even other feminists say that that was about censorship. It never was. It was a civil rights ordinance.
Yes.
Can you explain that for once and for all, what that really said and what it really meant and what it really would have done?
Yeah, I wish there was a once and for all, and I wish that, in fact, it was possible to undo the extraordinary disinformation that's been spread around the country and around the world, for that matter. Catherine McKinnon and I, at the request of a group of very, very poor people whose neighborhood was saturated with pornography, wrote an amendment to the civil rights ordinance of the city of Minneapolis. And this bill was a civil bill, which meant there's no police enforcement, there's no criminal prosecution, nobody goes to jail. Pornography was defined in it as the sexually explicit subordination of women through pictures and or words, in which there are also one of 7 or 8 different scenarios, ranging from women being turned into objects and commodities, through women being raped and showing pleasure in being raped, through the sexual dismemberment of women for the purpose of having sex, hurting women.
Mm-hmm. It was essentially perceiving sex crime, perceiving pornography as hate crime. Now they're trying to add, like, gays and lesbians and other groups to hate crime bills. Is it similar in that sense?
It is similar, but it's very ironic because the notion of hate crime bills really is a logical development from the ordinance. Pornography is a whole system of exploitation. It's not a single event that can injure an individual or simply create a finite environment in which that person knows that they're considered inferior and that they're unwanted. Pornography creates incredible hostility and aggression towards women and appears to be causal in many acts of sexual abuse. And of course, women are hurt in the making of pornography, most of which is coerced. And so it goes so far beyond what hate speech is per se. The injuries are so much deeper, they are so much broader, that it has been extraordinary to watch people who oppose the ordinance on the grounds that it would inhibit free speech then go on as good little liberals to say, yes, you mustn't use those words because they hurt people's feelings. Now, obviously, the injuries of those words are deeper than people's feelings. You know, they are real injuries to real people. And I like the effort to try to stigmatize hate speech and to say that it's absolutely inappropriate in public places where we have to be and we all have a right to be there. But the fact of the matter is that pornography is a practice of such injury to women and to children, and sometimes to transsexuals and sometimes to men. And so what the ordinance does is to say that there are certain harms that we know come from pornography, and if one of these harms happens to you, you can sue the pornographer, you can sue the whole chain of profit, anybody who's made a profit from that pornography, and you can get it taken off of the market by an injunction that is narrowly written. You can get damages from the pornographer so that you who have nothing will have something from someone who took something from you, the only thing you have, a piece of yourself. It's very carefully written, and it doesn't ban books, and it never has. It was passed twice in Minneapolis, which by two different city councils, Minneapolis is a very progressive city. It was supported by all of the neighborhood poor people's groups, the groups of people of color throughout the whole city, feminists. I mean, it had grassroots support on such a large level. I have never seen feminists organize a city in the way that Minneapolis was organized around the issue of pornography. Then we are told by demagogues that it's a right-wing initiative because it's against pornography. Well, no right-wing initiative ever had these values, not ever. And when you look at attacking pornography as a form of male dominance, what you see is then the right will defend the pornography. So that when the ordinance was passed in Indianapolis, which is it's a more conservative city than Minneapolis. In Minneapolis, the mayor wouldn't sign it, so he vetoed it. It never went into effect. In Indianapolis, the mayor did sign it. The first court that it went to, the city was sued within an hour of passing it, saying that the existence of the law would chill the First Amendment rights of people who wanted to read and write. In other words, that reading and writing could not coexist with this law. And so the courts issued an injunction against the use of the law. The first judge who declared it unconstitutional was a woman. She was a Reagan appointee. She was a right-wing woman. And she said that sex discrimination is never as important as freedom of speech, and that adult women can protect themselves. What's the problem? All right, so that was the first right-wing take on the ordinance. Then, on the appeals level, a right-wing judge named Frank Easterbrook wrote the decision. He also was a Reagan appointee, and he said pornography causes all the injury these people say it does. He actually added that it causes women's wages to be lower, which we know it does, but we can't prove it, and we only asserted what we could prove. And then he said, but that only proves its power as speech, and therefore it must be protected. Now this is, in point of fact, in truth, in reality, documented reality, what happens when pornography is attacked because of what it does to women. All right, not as an issue of moralism, not an effort to censor sexual feelings, sexual expression, but when it's done as an issue of power and powerlessness, the right will defend the pornography as the left does. And that's what happened. And the ordinance is being taught in every law school in the country. There are governments all over the world that are in the process of enacting it into the law. And yet here, I and other people who have been active to try to do this are treated as if we in fact are inquisitors. And it's at the same time, for me, it's so unbearable and so unbelievable, because I'm the political writer then who can't get her work published. And so I get a little bit tired of people talking to me about freedom of speech, since I'm the one who's trying to speak out against a power structure that's trying to destroy me, and it's trying to destroy other women too. But it certainly is an amazing object lesson, isn't it? If you see what's happened to me trying to do something about pornography, it's not likely to be something you will want to do yourself. And I think that that is the reason for all of this. It's to intimidate us, it's to threaten us, it's to keep us from telling the truth from our point of view, and our point of view has always been kept out of the public discourse. It's a way of creating silence again around all these issues of sexual exploitation.
Well, I have a lot of friends who work in battered women's shelters, and I have been told over and over by friends who have counseled battered women that literally pornography is used as training materials. I mean, they do what they see. They find a new wrinkle, a new way to do it, they do it. And so I had thought of it as almost like product liability. It's like if you're injured by a vehicle, you get to sue the manufacturer of that vehicle. If you're injured by pornography, you ought to get to sue the manufacturer of the pornography. I mean, it just made such perfect sense to me. Mm-hmm. It seemed like the most brilliant, innovative approach I'd ever heard of. And when people started talking about it as censorship, I kept saying, no, this is more like product liability. I mean, there was a thing in one of Sarah Lucia Hoagland's books where she talked about how if people were injured by cars as often as women are injured by men, they would take them off the market. I mean, they're just like not safe.
That's right.
And how it was just like inconceivable to her as a feminist that marriage is so dangerous for women, and yet we keep promoting it as though it's this wonderful institution.
Because our lives don't matter. And the tragic part of it is that they don't matter to us very much either. It's very hard to think that you are worth anything when you are surrounded by the kind of insult that's in pornography, that's translated into life in the way men talk to you when you walk down the street, or in the way you're treated whenever you have an ambition that is, that requires freedom in order to do it, in order to attain it. And one of the most heartbreaking things to me about dealing with the politics around the ordinance was that I began to understand that the biggest problem really was that women couldn't say, I deserve this, I have a right to this. You're not the only one who lives here. We live here too. And actually, you don't get to do this to us. I draw the line here. I draw it actually right where my body begins. And, in First Amendment law, there is this, I don't know what it is, cliche, platitude, whatever. Your freedom ends where my nose begins, which for men is true. But for women, where our genitals begin is not the end of men's freedom. And because this really is a nasty conflict. Men really like pornography. Some men make enormous profits off of pornography. Pornography is sex for many men. Men really do see women as they are trained to see women by pornography. They do treat women in the ways in which pornography encourages them to. The fact of the matter is that there's a fair amount of conflict involved in going up against this social institution. And I think that women have been unable to bear the thought of doing what's necessary in order to make this institution collapse.
When I read Handmaid's Tale, there is a strong implication in there that we sort of brought this right-wing regime on ourselves by being activists against pornography. There's a scene where, as a young girl, the main character is witnessing her mother taking part in a demonstration, and she doesn't understand why they're burning these pictures. And the implication is that we, as one of my feminist friends likes to put it, got in bed with the right wing, and that somehow or other we brought this on ourselves by our attempt to protect ourselves from pornography.
Well, I think that's a correct reading of The Handmaid's Tale. I think that Margaret Atwood is saying that. I think she's saying that that was the turning point that then led to a totalitarian society such as the one she describes. And I also think that that's the reason that the book was so successful. I think it's the reason that it got the critical acclaim that it got. I think it's the reason that the apparent sexual politics of the rest of the book were palatable, because there was a denunciation right in the heart of the book that the kind of radical attack on male dominance that in fact we have organized is really just collusion with the right. And that has been the strongest propaganda effort. I don't just mean in Margaret Atwood's book, but I mean that accusation to try to, I don't know what, to shame us, to misrepresent us, to basically suggest that we're dishonorable and that what we're doing is dishonorable. The only good part about it, and there is a good part about it, happily things don't always work the way people in power think they will. The more right-wing women read that we were in league with them, the more interested they became in what we were doing. And for the first time, many right-wing women began to think about male dominance because they do hate pornography. Most women of any political stripe do hate it. And I think it's real interesting when right-wing women begin to think about pornography as a form of male dominance instead of in obscenity terms. And I think that that's a move forward. So that is kind of been the good thing that's come out of it. And I must say, you know, as much as I've been misrepresented and lied about, my job, as I see it, or my conviction, is not that what I want to do in life is to defend the left from the right. I mean, I gave up that fight. I didn't find that the left was very kind to women. And I want to fight for women. And when a woman is raped, the rapist does not ask her politics. He doesn't say, who did you vote for in the last election? He doesn't say, what's your relationship to Ronald Reagan? Do you like him or don't you? Because if you do like him, I'll go find somebody else who doesn't like him and really punish that left-wing woman. So, you know, I think that raises a lot of political questions and ethical questions for feminists, but I don't understand a feminist movement that doesn't try to eliminate injury to all women.
I was hoping you could explain it to me, actually. That was why I said it was probably an impossible question, because I don't know how to respond to those anti-censorship feminists that are so critical of your work. I mean, I am as passionately anti-censorship as the next person, but this is an issue of, you know, the theory that creates the practice of patriarchy, and I don't get it. You know, it's like, why do men hate us so much, and why do some feminists feel like they have to defend men's right to hate us so publicly?
I think that there's been an awful lot of lying going on about why women who consider themselves to be feminists, many of whom have done some feminist things, are protecting pornography. I mean, I think that there is an enormous amount of duplicity involved in the ways in which they're politically articulating their positions. I think that they're lying, for one thing, about their reasons. I don't think the First Amendment is the reason. I think it's a much more sexually motivated reason. I think that for liberal women, it has to do with not destroying alliances with liberal men, and liberal men want pornography. And I think that with radical lesbian women, some of whom are on the pro-pornography side, they really are pro-pornography. They are defending the practice of S&M. They are defending the kind of dominance and submission that goes with that practice. They are insisting that that is a form of dissent, whereas to me it's the ultimate conformity. And there's a lot of self-hatred involved in, you know, being a member of a class that's oppressed in the ways that women are oppressed. And I think that there's an identification with the person who hurts women. And It has nothing to do with feminism as I understand it. And I also think that the bad faith is clear in the way, for instance, that I've been attacked. It has been as if many of these women are saying to the pornographers, do whatever you want to her. We don't stand with her, we stand with you. I mean, there is a way to have a disagreement over a social policy issue that doesn't say, look, would you hurt her for us? You know, we really are tired of having her around. It's been hurt her for us that has come out of what those women have done, not a social policy debate.
Well, the one feminist I know who absolutely, I trust her ethics, who is in that camp, it's because she is a sexologist and she cannot make the distinction between eliminating pornography and the kind of anti-sexual message of patriarchy in general. And one of the things I thought was so extraordinary about Mercy is the way in which your character, Andrea, tries to find freedom through sex. I mean, who believes that sex is a sacred act that bonds people, that gives you the most freedom possible. And I think the few feminists I know who really do have trouble with your work from the anti-pornography point of view, it's because they're afraid the way that patriarchy conflates sex and sexism, that if you eliminate sexism and dominance and pornography and all of the representations of sex, that you somehow or other would be attacking sexuality itself.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely extraordinary not to be able to make the distinction between sex and sexual abuse. But if you look at women's lives, of course, it's a very hard distinction to make from your own experience. In the early days of working against pornography, I was always very careful never to use pornography and sex as synonyms. And when men would interview me, they would use the words as synonyms. And I quickly learned that for them, those two words meant basically the same thing. For some of them, sex would be broader than just pornography, but pornography was in fact a form of sex for them. It never was for most women. And this book, Mercy, is a lot about sexual freedom. And in fact, there's a lot of consensual sex in it. Sometimes that consensual sex is interrupted by rape, by a brutality, because, outside of the courtroom, the fact of the matter is that if you're in the middle of making love with a woman and she says, no, you goddamn stop, you stop, right? But there's one chapter, and I think it's a very brutal chapter and a very important chapter in the book, in which she really takes a fancy to a particular man. She really wants him. She really wants to make love with him. And in the course of that, and she's describing him with tremendous sensuousness and tremendous desire, he in fact virtually destroys her through throat rape. And there are other scenes in the book, other places in the book, where she is passionately sexually in love. And yet the politics of domination destroy that love. And I think that you're right to say that she does think that sex is the arena for freedom. And probably one of the most frustrating things in this whole so-called debate for me is that I really thought that feminism came out of understanding that sexual liberation was not going to be liberation for women. I mean, there is a whole generation of women who have gone through this already. Thank you very much. It's very tiresome to watch it all happening again. And it's kind of heartbreaking to know that people can then take feminism and try to use it as a cover for sexual liberation, which didn't work. It didn't work for us. It didn't give us what we needed, which was some tenderness, some equality, some fairness, some justice, and some real freedom.
One of the things that impressed me about Mercy was the way in which your character, Andrea, tries to find her way to liberation through sexuality, and has a genuine passion for the men she becomes involved with, and how how their notions of what it means to be a man really destroy the sacred nature of her interactions with them.
And she at one point she says something like, they expect you to be an apple on the tree, and they come and they pick you, and then suddenly because they've picked you, then you're supposed to love them. And that's not the way she does anything. She makes her own decisions. She knows what she wants. She knows who she wants to make love with and not. And that's true. And most of the book is about acquaintance rape. There's also a part of the book in which she talks about what she calls finding her freedom with a woman, and the woman is another street woman. And she talks about being almost an apprentice to that woman and learning freedom from her body, from the way that she lives through sex. And, I think that is real. And I think that there's very little place for women's active desire to exist in this world. I think gender is a lot of lies anyway, and that the kind of force that's required to keep men and women distinct and separate, and one dominant and the other submissive, and one in control and one out of control, is a kind of force that belies nature. I mean, it suggests that in nature this is not what would happen. This is not who we are. She does find sex to be one experience of passion. And the reason that I put it that way is that for her, life is about passion. That's what it is. And the consequences to her of being sexually abused are different from the consequences to her of feeling desire, wanting sex, having sex. And that's part of the reason that I find this whole discussion around pornography so deeply inauthentic and corrupt, because I don't really find that there's a problem in telling the difference between those two things. What I like about her as a character is that she is so self-determining in a world that has predetermined that she's going to be victimized over and over again.
Well, I just wanted to lead her into a library and sit her down and tell her to write woman hating, It was like, you could start here.
Well, my little joke to myself, I suppose. The two last chapters, the suicide chapter and then the chapter in which she starts to hurt men back, basically, are both dated April 30th, 1974, which is the day on which Woman Hating was published. And I have often in subsequent years wondered whether it was an act of suicide or whether it was an act of homicide. I'm constantly accused of basically having committed homicide with the book, and yet it feels so suicidal to me.
I thought it was an act of liberation for me as a reader, but
well, that's why I say that it's sort of a personal joke. And I mean, it is very weird to have people react to acts of liberation as if they're murderous and destructive.
Well, they are to patriarchy.
I think that that's why feminists are always treated that way. And yet when you look at the real violence in the world of political movements as well as of dominating classes, I mean, when you look at political resistance, a lot of it has been violent. And when you look at the way feminists are perceived, we're perceived as being violent when in fact we rarely, if ever, commit acts of violence. Our language is the simple refusal to conform is taken to be an act that is the equivalent of having killed or destroyed a man, because it's our submission that creates his masculinity. So if we withdraw it, his masculinity in some sense is less or dies or diminishes, and so we have done something violent to him.
I just keep wondering what would have happened to your character if she had, gotten to read Virginia Woolf and Andrea Dworkin. I mean, one of the things that saved me as that inarticulate working class girl that I was, too, who believed what all those male writers wrote because I thought I could be free, and it took me a while to realize that being in a female body, I wasn't allowed to do that. But it was the women's movement that saved me. It was getting to read Woman Hating and Mary Daly and Adrienne Rich and Alice Walker. And, it was getting some sense that it wasn't just happening to me, that I wasn't just this victim, that in fact it was a system, and a system could be organized against and fought. And so that's why I have this longing to drag her into the library, because I knew what was there in 1974. I mean, I started reading feminist stuff in 1970, and it was I just wish that I could give her the consciousness that you as the author have, because being able to write, I think, would save her life.
I think that's probably right up to the point when she might be raped again. And I think that if she were raped again, she wouldn't survive it. And I think that we all have that, all of us who are women have that point of no return in our lives where, finally we simply can't sustain another assault. And we don't know when it will come or if it will come. Maybe it won't, maybe it will. I mean, that's true for me as the writer. And it's probably true for you in ways that you know what that assault would be. That would be the final one. And it's awful having to live in a world where that's the truth. See, I don't think individuals can possibly be stronger than this system. I think ultimately as individuals they get each and every one of us. But together, we could be stronger than this system. And that's why it's so demoralizing to watch the effect of sexual abuse on women's capacity to endure in a political resistance. I mean, that's what's so hard about our situation now.
Yeah. Well, you have written this extraordinary novel that is breaking new ground in literature, in my opinion. I am just so grateful to you for doing your work because it has meant so much in my life, and I'm so glad I got this opportunity to talk with you about your work. My guest has been Andrea Dworkin, who is a radical feminist and an activist who, with Catherine A. McKinnon, developed an ordinance for the city of Minneapolis that recognized pornography as a form of sex discrimination, and who is the author of a novel called Mercy. This has been Josy Catoggio for Feminist Magazine.